to our podcast today. We appreciate you joining us. Today's podcast is going to cover material that'll be found in Mosiah chapters 25 through 29 and Alma chapters 1 through 4. And let me begin today's podcast with a little bit of a disclaimer. This podcast is kind of politically driven by Mosiah chapter 29. So I don't take any offense to anything that we might be discussing today, but we're going to focus our discussion on the reign of judges. Now, to appreciate what was happening in Zarahemla at the time there was this big shift from kings to judges, we need to consider the various demographics, the politics, the religious factors that were involved. Zarahemla at this particular time was a conglomerate, a very diverse population. The people from King Mosiah had moved in with the people of Zarahemla, or the Mulekites. And soon after, there was the arrival of Zeniff, ruled by Lemhi. And so you've got these folks coming together. And then you have the people of Alma, the converted people of Alma, and even a few of the children of Amulon who had opted to become Nephites. And so you've got a lot of folks coming together at one particular time. Well, this diverse population had created some complications, and unity in the people were starting to unravel to a bit. Many of the younger generation, those who had not covenanted at the time of King Benjamin, rose up against the church, and one of those was Alma's own son, Alma the Younger. He and 4 sons of Mosiah secretly worked actually to try to destroy the faith of many. Now, King Mosiah, this is King Mosiah the Younger, prior to his death, he initiated 3 bold sweeping changes within his kingdom here. First, he was going to allow independent churches to flourish there in Zarahemla. Second proposal was to eliminate this concept of kings. And the third proposal was to establish a new political system referred to as the reign of judges. Now, in preparation for stepping down prior to his impending death, Mosiah consolidated all the records that had been entrusted in his care, and he gave them to Alma the Younger, and commanded him that he should keep and preserve them, and also that he should keep a record of his own, of the people. So at Mosiah's death, Alma the Younger was initially given 3 very high callings. He became the high priest of the church, he was the chief judge and leader of the army. Now eventually Alma is going to relinquish all of these assignments other than that of high priest. In Alma 4:20, it says, confining himself wholly to the high priesthood of the holy order of God, to the testimony of the word, according to the spirit of revelation and prophecy. So Alma did this. He relinquished all these things except high priest because he needed to try and keep the religious fabric of Zarahemla together. It was kind of unraveling at this particular point in time. With this particular summary of our reading material, I'd like to spend the balance of our podcast today focusing and discussing this concept of government by the people then and now. Also, I'd have you ponder one question as we talk through this reading material. Why did Mormon include Mosiah's transition government in the translated record of Joseph Smith? I want you to ponder that while we go through our material. Now, I read an interesting article recently written by a fellow named Byron R. Merrill entitled Government by the Voice of the People. So during the course of our podcast, I'll share a thought or two that I've taken from his research. Now, the reign of the kings among the Nephites began with Nephi, when he was asked to be their king. He became known as a king or protector, and those who would reign after him became known as 2nd Nephi, 3rd Nephi, 4th Nephi, and so forth. But we're really only aware of 4 kings. You have Nephi, and then you have Mosiah 1, and then you have, or Mosiah the Elder, and then you have his son, King Benjamin, and then from King Benjamin you have Mosiah the Second, or Mosiah the Younger. These men were all prophets as well as civic leaders. In Jeremiah 1:7, it says, "Our kings and our leaders were mighty men in the face of the Lord." In Mosiah chapter 29, King Mosiah II, or King Mosiah the younger, proposed to the people that they eliminate this monarchy of kingship and shift to a reign of judges through the voice of the people. Mosiah used all of the powers of persuasion he could find to convince the people that this government shift would be in their best interest. Mosiah highlighted, however, the reign of his father, King Benjamin, as exactly what a righteous king ought to be. And if the people could always be confident that a king like Benjamin could be found, then it would be okay to have the reign of kings. However, he stated that not all men are just, as his father was, and it was expedient for them to eliminate this kingship role. Mosiah reminded the people of what it must have been like to be ruled during the days of wicked King Noah. He further mentioned the long-term significance of this proposed change. In Mosiah chapter 29, verses 26 and 27, it's really a profound couple of verses. He says, "Now it is not common that the voice of the people desire anything contrary to that which is right, but it is common for a lesser part of the people to desire that which is not right. Therefore, this shall you observe and make it your law, to do your business by the voice of the people." And then here's the disclaimer. "And if the time comes that the voice of the people does choose iniquity, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. Yea, then is the time he will visit you with great destruction, even as he has hitherto visited this land." Mosiah then proposed the mechanics under which this reign of judges ought to be initiated, with lower judges that would then be judged by higher judges. And if there was an unrighteous higher judge, then a group of lower judges would judge that individual. And so all of this would be administered through the voice of the people. Now, the proposed title of judge is the very same title used in ancient Israel. The Old Testament judges held similarly administrative and management responsibilities for the people. Often they were referred to as their deliverers, or those that would help them, or help Israel in this case, be relieved of oppression. Mosiah's desire that America should be a land of liberty required strict laws which were given them by their fathers. These laws were the standard by which all would be judged in the future. Now, specifically indicating, and this is very important, that these laws were given by the hand of the Lord. Mosiah's proposal closely resembled the plan that Moses had put into place to govern Israel, as recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, it says, "How can I myself alone bear your cumbrance and your burdens and your strife? Take you wise men and understanding and known among your tribes, and I will make them rulers over you. And I charge your judges at that time, saying, Hear the causes between your brethren, and judge righteously between every man and his brother." Now, Mosiah also indicated that since the law is the ultimate standard, that the people must stand on equal footing before the law. That means no preferences to wealth, birth, or position. He desired that every man enjoy the right and privilege of free agency. Now, speaking of free agency, Elder Dallin H. Oakes defined free agency as, "Free agency means an exercise of the will, the power to choose. Freedom means the power and privilege to carry out one's choices." Well, not only did each Nephite have the moral duty to keep the commandments of God, but now each assumed the additional responsibility of preserving those laws of God. You know, people often express a desire for someone to protect and care for them. It's as if they're not capable of caring for themselves. Satan cleverly persuades them to relinquish responsibilities for their lives in exchange for some sort of anticipated safety or security. These people are often hesitant to determine their future by their own set of choices. Thus, Mosiah wrote at length, explaining carefully to the people what they should do, and then to convince them that they in fact could really do it. Now, his people understood and accepted the entire shift of responsibility. In Mosiah chapter 29, verse 38, it says, "Therefore they relinquished their desire for a king and became exceedingly anxious that every man should have an equal chance throughout all the land. Yea, and every man expressed a willingness to answer for his own sins." You know, this concept of election by the voice of the people seems to prevail somewhat throughout the history of the Book of Mormon, because Mormon's statement that the people of Nephi appointed me that I should be their leader implies that some form of government by the voice of the people still continued right through the conclusion of the Book of Mormon. Sadly, that voice chose iniquity, however, and it resulted in the tragic end of the Nephite civilization, just as Mosiah had prophesied. And you know, it is worth restating. And if the time comes that the voice of the people does choose iniquity, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. Yea, then is the time he will visit you with great destruction, even as he has hitherto visited this land. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of our podcast, I wanted to discuss Mosiah's government by the voice of the people then and now. So what does Mosiah chapter 29 have to do with us today? Well, in our day, the Lord has said the Constitution of the United States of America was created by wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose. In Doctrine and Covenants section 101, verse 80, it says, "And for this purpose have I established the Constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood." Well, if the Lord could orchestrate the miracle of the Constitution in preparing for the latter-day restoration so that Israel may be gathered and the people prepared for the second coming of the Savior, can there be any doubt that the same God of heaven could direct a prophet king named Mosiah to establish a government by the voice of the people to prepare them for the first coming of the Savior? Just as the Lord approved the change in the Nephite affairs that Mosiah was initiating, he likewise placed his approval on the United States Constitution by revealing that it had suffered it to be established, and that it should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh according to just and holy principles. You know, President Ezra Taft Benson has indicated that the Constitution's genius lies in 5 basic eternal principles. First, free agency is God-given. Second, the proper role of government is to secure the rights and freedoms of individuals. Third, basic human rights are God-given. Fourth, people are superior to the governments that they form. And lastly, the governments should only have limited powers. Well, the system of judges adopted by the Nephites had these same eternal principles outlined here by President Benson. Just as Mosiah drew on inspiration in the writings of ancient Israel, so did America's founding fathers do the same. There's an interesting study done on the origin and nature of American political thinking. And what they did is that they examined public writings of the founding fathers from 1760 through 1805. Now, the intent of this research was to find which European political people were the most influential and quoted most often in the early thinking of America. Well, surprisingly, that which was most quoted and cited were quotations taken from the book of Deuteronomy. The study shows that 34% of all of the quotations cited by our founding fathers were actually taken from the Holy Bible. But just as Mosiah desired that Inequality should be no more. The Constitution safeguards the same rights regardless of social standing or economic status. This led the prophet Joseph Smith to say, "Hence we say that the Constitution of the United States is our glorious standard. It is founded in the wisdom of God." Similar to Mosiah's warnings that only righteous choices could preserve liberty, we find warnings from such individuals as Daniel Webster and John Adams. John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the governments of any other." As the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville said in 1831, "America is great because it is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America would cease to be great." Now, I asked early in the podcast today the question, why did Mormon include this transition government of Mosiah in the translated record of Joseph Smith? I think it's imperative, as Nephi counseled in 1 Nephi 19:23, that we liken all scriptures unto us, that it may be for our benefit and our learning. Well, you know, the parallels in the history of the development of both Mosiah's government and that of the United States are uncanny. They're very, very similar. Both nations initially acknowledged the hand of the Lord in granting freedom. Both nations were greatly blessed materially and spiritually. Both nations were successful in defending themselves against enemy invasion. And the Church of Christ was established and headquartered amongst both nations. Unfortunately, both nations became selfish, and the love of liberty gave way to pride, and the Nephite nation collapsed into anarchy and chaos. And our government's final chapters have not been fully written yet, but I fear perhaps the writing is on the wall. What has happened? Where have our inalienable rights gone? Mosiah's belief that because God gives people both rights and laws, people should bear personal responsibility for their choices and for their actions. Well, today, the idea of sovereignty of the people appears to mean only that the majority will be supreme. And since the existence of God is largely denied, they believe that the government is, in fact, the supreme grantor of rights and laws. And if that's the case, then the government can both grant laws and rights and withdraw laws and rights, meaning that God's God-given rights to us are no longer inalienable rights. The concept of divine standards of laws is very foreign to today's legal thinking. With such a small portion of the U.S. population voting, some have surmised that only a minority is currently formulating policy and making laws in this nation. Thus, through the complacency or apathy, perhaps, of the majority, even a minority with unrighteous desires and designs can become the voice of the people. What is happening to the Constitution to render it seemingly ineffective to preserve those rights and freedoms that Mosiah has emphasized? Well, the inspired Constitution provides for orderly changes through amendments, but it does not, and let me repeat, it does not provide for the changing of the underlying constitutional principles that our very foundation and system of government are established upon. There are now those who consider themselves empowered to interpret the Constitution in a very revisionary manner and to reflect the prevailing attitudes or opinions of the time, thinking our Constitution is broken and it needs to be replaced. Now, why has this happened? You know, freedom today mirrors the disintegration of personal morality. Hiram Smith once said, "To vote for wicked men would be a sin." And so some have asked our church leaders, well, just tell us who to vote for. President Harold B. Lee said, "When people ask me who to vote for, I tell them to read Mosiah 29 and Doctrine and Covenants section 134, and then to pray about it, and then they will know exactly who to vote for whenever there's an election." Fortunately, or unfortunately as the case may be, people in a free society always get the governments that they deserve. Again, in the words of President Harold B. Lee, "We alone know by revelation as to how the Constitution came into being, and we alone know by revelation the destiny of this nation." In 1866, President Brigham Young said, "I hope and trust and pray that the government of our country may remain, because it is so good. But if they cut off this, or cast out that, or institute another thing, they may destroy all the good it contains. This I hope they will not do." They cannot do it. I expect to see the day when the elders of Israel will protect and sustain civil and religious liberty and every constitutional right bequeathed to us by our fathers, and spread those rights abroad in connection with the gospel for the salvation of all nations. So why did Mormon include this record? He included the record of the reign of the judges as a witness of what had happened with an early experiment with government by the voice of the people on this land, which is choice above all other lands. He included it as a sober warning and reminder to his readers that the American experience will also terminate in chaos and tragedy unless we heed the lessons taught within the pages of the Book of Mormon. The words of Mosiah, in particular Mosiah chapter 29, are words that need to be heeded if America is to survive. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion today, and I look forward to our next podcast. We will review materials that are found in your Come Follow Me manual in Alma chapters 5 through 12. That would be weeks 24 and 25 for those of you that are following. And again, next time we meet, it'll be another political discussion as we talk about lawyers. Thanks again for joining me.